In the last video, we created a send to QA column using a simplified workflow. In this video, we'll look at how to get the same result if you're not using a simplified workflow. And as I mentioned in the last video, if you're fine with a simplified workflow and that's what you're using, you can skip this video. But if you're not, let's get started by first clearing out what we just added in the last video using that simplified workflow. So I'm going to come in and delete this column here. And now we want to actually get rid of that status because we're going to recreate it through the process in this video. So the status is still there, but let's actually delete that. So I'm going to come into my settings over here to issues. And then if we scroll down over here on the left-hand side, we will see statuses. And the status that we want to get rid of is this send to QA that we had created. So this is actually still applied in a workflow, so we can't actually delete that. So what we need to do is to deactivate that from the workflow. However, we can't actually do that because this workflow is still active. So first we need to create a new workflow and then apply that to our project, and that will make the current simplified workflow inactive so that we can get rid of it. Okay, so that'll make more sense as we walk through this. So I'm going to come into workflows here, and let's create a new workflow. So add workflow. This will be our dev team workflow. Add this in. Now, right now, this workflow is currently inactive. And what we want to do is to make it active on the dev team project, but we don't have any of those other statuses in that the dev team workflow is currently using. So let's start to add those in. And I want to make sure, let's open this up in a new tab because I want to make sure that I get the right workflows. So I'm going to, or the right statuses rather. So I'm going to view the existing ones. So these are the existing statuses that we're using. And basically I'm going to add all of these back in except for send to QA. Okay, so let's come in and add in our backlog. So you can see this status already exists. We're not creating a new status. We're just adding in one that exists. I'm going to allow all statuses to transition to this one, and that's going to allow all of these to transition, all of the different statuses to transition across each other. And the backlog is actually the one that is, when a new issue is created, it's added into backlog. So let's come in here and add that over here. Yep. And this, we can actually remove that status because we don't need that anymore because that's not one in the current workflow. We have selected for development. So that's another one. We can just add those in. We have in progress. And again, I know I'm moving pretty quickly on here. This is something that I'd mentioned at the very beginning of this course. This is a high-level course. So if you're not familiar with workflows and how workflows work in general, I would recommend checking out my Understanding JIRA course. And that's much more kind of introductory level on a lot of the concepts in JIRA, including workflows. So we need done. Now, that's the last one that we should need to add in. There we go. Done. Add that in. And all right, so we have all of our statuses except for send to QA. So I'm going to come in and we need to apply this workflow to the project. So to do that, we need to actually take the scheme and apply the workflow to that scheme. Because let's take a look at this. I'll show you what I mean by that. So let's come into our workflow schemes, and we can see currently the dev project, this project is using this scheme, and it's using the workflow. It's saying, okay, any of these types. So we can have different issue types using different workflows if we wanted to. And so we could get this to be a lot more complex where we say, bugs go through a completely different workflow. And so we only want the bug issue type to be able to be assigned to send to QA, for whatever reason, we might want to change that. I'm going to keep this a little bit more open and less restrictive and start with that there. So I'm just going to come in and edit this workflow scheme. And rather than use this workflow, let's add an existing workflow. That is the new workflow that we just created. All unassigned issues. And that is going to overwrite the workflow that we currently had assigned there. Okay, so when I publish this, that's going to update that. And it's basically saying, okay, all of these statuses are good, except in this new workflow, there's no send to QA status. So if there's any issues that are currently in that status, I need to know what you want to map that to. We can see that there's currently no issues in this status, of course, because we just created it. And so it's fine. I'm just going to leave this at the default, associate that, because really nothing's really going to move since there were no issues there. So let JIRA do its thing. Once that's done, that workflow is published. And so now that that new workflow is assigned, effectively what we've done is we've replaced the simplified workflow. So we're not using the simplified workflow anymore. And we could even change this title here just to make it a little more straightforward that we're not using the simplified workflow anymore. All right, so now that we have that, let's add in the status. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is let's just walk through this as if we needed to actually get rid of that status and replace it with something else. We can do that. So we can see, oh, it's still not letting us delete that. What is that? Oh, it's because it's still in that workflow. So let's come back over here to the workflows. And now that workflow is no longer active, but now that it's inactive, I can edit this. And I can come in and remove this status. There we go. So with that removed, now if I come over to the statuses, you can see now it's not associated anywhere. We can delete this status, and there we go. Okay, so we've walked through that, and we've effectively gotten rid of everything that we did in the previous video and with the simplified workflow, and we've also replaced the simplified workflow with a new workflow that's not the automated simplified one that JIRA is using. So now what we need to do is to basically recreate that status that we just got rid of. I just want to show how we can walk through that process. So let's hop back into our workflows here, and let's edit the workflow. And with this here, we can add in a status. And now if I do a send to QA status, you can see it doesn't exist. So this is going to be a new one. Add that in, and want to make sure this is in a in progress category, because that's in progress. There we go. Hit create, and there we go. I just like to organize these a little bit better. Doesn't really matter how you have them organized. That's just a visual thing. But with all of these added, none of this is going to apply until we actually publish that. So this is not actually live until we publish. So we publish. No, I don't want to create a backup, and publish that. And now it is currently active. So now that this is active, it's active in the project. And if you remember, the board that we created in a previous video is also assigned to that project. And so that's how JIRA knows that these are the statuses that are going to be used on that board. All we need to do now is to make sure to map those statuses to the different columns on the board. Okay, so let's hop back into our projects and come over to projects here. Find our dev team project, and that'll get us back to the board. Once we're on the board, let's come over to the board settings. And we can see, okay, these are statuses that are not mapped yet. So let's add in a column. And now when I add this column, you'll see this is different than what we did in the previous video. It's not automatically adding the status. Okay, so all of that was to kind of show some of the automation that's going on behind the scenes when you're using a simplified workflow. You can see we're no longer using a simplified workflow. Now, we could get back to a simplified one if we wanted to by clicking on this here and walking through that process, but I wanted to show both sides depending on how your projects are set up. And now all we need to do is to take this, drag it over there, and we've mapped that status. So basically what this means is that when someone drags an issue from to do or in progress over to the send to QA column, it will assign the status of send to QA to that issue. All right, so with our dev teams board created, let's move on to our next video where we will create a different board for our QA team to use.